Welcome to 20th Century Music and Arts. In this episode, I'm going to look at the history of noise rock in the state of Texas. Now, in my last two episodes, I looked at noise rock coming out of New York City, which had always been a hub for the avant-garde. But then there's Texas, the Lone Star State. I get images of cowboys and kind of moral conservatism. However, this sunny state has a long history of bands that created crazy noisy sounds that challenged the conventions of rock music. This goes right back to the 60s, and we're going to look at a couple of bands that really pushed the boundaries of psychedelic rock, and one of those bands was really one of the first ones to embrace that term. Now, of course, the first band I'm talking about is the 13th Floor Elevators. They were formed in Austin, Texas in 1965. They were put together by the great Roky Erickson. He was the lead vocalist and the main songwriter. Now, there was a scene that developed around the band that was very parallel to what was going on in San Francisco at the time. But this band was different from what you would hear from that scene. They're like a fierce form of garage rock that infused elements of folk, R&B, and just a lot of psychedelic chaos. Now again, they were one of the first bands to embrace that term psychedelic, and hence their first album, released in November 1966, was called The Psychedelic Sounds of the 13th Floor Elevators. While many mid-60s bands flirted with the idea of altered states, going on a trip, the Elevators built their entire identity around that, both musically and philosophically. And, the result is an album. It's just raw, it's evangelistic, it's generally unsettling. Okay, and of course, this is because of Roky Erickson. His voice, it's like a feral instrument. It howls, yelps, and pleads through the record. There's a sense of rockabilly, garage rock, and just something more unhinged. You can hear that in tracks like You're Gonna Miss Me, which was their most famous song, Fire Engine. It's not that his vocals are so much sung, they're like exercised. There's like an urgency to it. Musically, the album's got a really different sound, and one component is the electric jug, like the jug that you would hear in like a hillbilly band, but they've electrified it. But it's not really just this silly novelty. It actually kind of like pulses through all the songs. It's like this hypnotic driver, and it just reinforces the trance-like grooves. The guitars are great. They're really sharp and repetitive, and this is just one of the greatest psychedelic and one of the greatest garage rock albums of all time, hands down. Now, their follow-up, Easter Everywhere, in 1967, it's a bit more ambitious, it's deeper, it's stranger, more psychedelic, and it's a bit more inward-looking. I'd recommend that one as well. Trying to get back to you. Unfortunately, time we get to Bull of the Woods, released in 1968, things were kind of falling apart for the band. They're caught up in legal troubles, and of course, Roky Erickson was having a serious mental health crisis. Now, it didn't help that he was arrested for drug possession and was possibly facing a very long prison sentence, so he pleaded insanity and got a deal to go to a mental hospital. Now, he was having severe mental health issues as well, but the types of treatments may have exacerbated those issues and not helped them. He was subjected to a lot of Thorazine and electric shock therapy. When he did emerge out of the hospital in the early mid-70s, he was able to put together a band together and play some really great music. I will cover that in another episode, though. But the 13th Floor Elevators show that Texas was a hub of experimentation right back to the 1960s. Now, a contemporary band of the 13th Floor Elevators was Red Krayola, and I've actually done an episode where I featured them. They're just an incredible band. They were formed by Mayo Thompson, Frederick Barthelme, the author, and Steve Cunningham. Now, this is a band that embraces free jazz and experimental composers like John Cage and Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, you really got to check out their 1967 album, Parable of an Arable Land. And on the one hand, you have some straightforward tracks. Intermixed with that are just these complete sounds of noise. And this wasn't just created by the band, this was created by up to 50 different people. And we're talking true noise. So I'm talking power tools, I'm talking a motorcycle engine. They called them their freeform freakouts, okay? And the longer tracks that are songs are still very avant-garde and experimental. And Thompson, he has these really absurd lyrics. They seem so random in structure. Check out things like Hurricane Fighter, Transparent Radiation, Former Reflections, just really, really good stuff. Now, they had a couple of follow-ups. One of them would not get released until the mid-90s because it was called Coconut Hotel and it consisted of 36 one-second pieces. Yeah, the record company said, no, we're not releasing it. And then their second album, God Bless Red Crayola and All Who Sail With It. Really good album, too. There's a lot of, like, minimalist experimentation on there. Again, you're getting this sound that's almost like early industrial music or something like what the German band Can was doing. A lot of really hypnotic, repetitive stuff. Now, Red Crayola were very much ahead of their time, and they really challenged the conventions of what pop music and rock music was. I really would recommend that Parable of an Arable Land album. And Red Crayola, they showed that Texas, a hub for experimentation.
Well, I have in my pocket a hurricane fighter plane. It's champagne for you. The sky is now clear. You can forget. I can see the house.
Now, these weird sounds, in terms of a rock music context, would emerge again when the punk and then later hardcore punk scene started to develop in Texas. And in various cities in Texas, there were thriving hardcore punk scenes. But I'm just going to mention two bands here that were very experimental. The first of these was Cultural Side. Now, Cultural Side was not only influenced by bands like the Sex Pistols, they were actually influenced by early industrial bands like Throbbing Gristle. And that was a big component of their sound. So they also have things like tape loops, and they embrace this idea of something called plunderphonics, where you'd take a whole track by maybe a famous band and you'd play that in the background. Now, when playing live, this would be interesting. They'd have all these tape recorders they could access so they could just play the samples. So they'd press play on the tape. And, you know, this fusion of sort of like straightforward punk rock and industrial, it can be heard on their 1982 album, Year One. But the real controversial album for them was their 1986 album, Tacky Souvenirs of a Pre-Revolutionary America. Oh boy, did this get them in trouble. So for example, they would play a whole track of a famous song, Dancing in the Dark by Bruce Springsteen or California Girls by the Beach Boys. And while that song's playing in the background, they would add noise and their own commentary over the top. This is absolutely hilarious. However, it got them in a lot of trouble. They got sued, and it caused a lot of problems for them. What was great about Cultural Side is they showed that they wanted to directly challenge and subvert the popular music trends that were happening at the time in the 1980s.
Can I buy you a drink? Would you like to dance? Can I buy you a drink? Would you like to dance?
Now, a contemporary of Cultural Side was Really Red. They're out of Houston, and again, they were one of the first Texas punk bands that went out on tour. They got a sound that's really quite fierce, like something like the Dead Kennedys they take inspiration from, but also they embrace a lot of the British post-punk sound, stuff like Magazine, Wire, and The Fall. You can hear that really intense fusion on their first LP, Teaching You Fear, and that was actually a commentary on some of the police violence that was happening in Houston at the time. There was a follow-up called Rest in Pain, where the band incorporated much more experimental and psychedelic influence, and they were paying homage to two bands, the 13th Floor Elevators and Red Crayola. In fact, they covered the Red Crayola song War Sucked.
Here comes your mother's son, and her question, apple pies are so obvious.
Now, unfortunately, they would break up in 1985, but you know, they were very important. They weren't just another regional punk band. They were kind of trailblazers. They combined intelligent political lyrics and dynamic music and a real DIY ethic. However, if we're talking about noise, and we're talking about Texas, there's really only one band that comes to mind, and we're talking about the Butthole Surfers. This has got to be one of the most uncategorizable bands in rock history, and these guys are some of the greatest provocateurs, especially during their live performances. Now, they came together around 1981. They were formed when Gibby Haynes and Paul Leary started playing together, and eventually under the name Butthole Surfers, which of course is quite a shocking name. Now, Haynes at the time was an accountant. Now, Haynes and Leary, they had a history of doing very provocative and shocking stuff. So they had published a magazine at one point called Strange VD. So they published photos of weird venereal disease medical conditions, but they created these fictional stories to explain why the conditions had happened. And I think it was this kind of shocking approach that they wanted to do in music as well. You got to remember, when they would play live, they would have films projected in the background. Now, these weren't just any films. They would show footage of these really graphic medical procedures, such as penis reconstruction surgery, gory driver's education films, where they showed accident footages, nuclear explosions, stuff that goes on inside a meat processing plant. And then alongside of that, they got these light shows, and they're playing all kinds of instruments. There's two drummers that are standing up playing this kind of tribal drum sound. And Gibby Haynes, he's singing through like a megaphone that distorts his voice. But then they're encouraging all the members of the audience to take psychedelic drugs. So they were initially kind of based out of the hardcore punk scene, but they had just gone beyond that right from the start. I mean, it's like punk meets psychedelia meets avant-garde insanity, and there's a whole lot of noise in it. And there's this darkest form of postmodern humor. I mean, absolutely nothing is sacred to this band. They start releasing music in 1983. They have their first self-titled EP. It's got this chaotic, abrasive sound, lots of noise, lots of like psychedelia, very jarring guitar work, silly lyrics, but this dark, humorous take on stuff. The song Hey, though, actually has a bit of a poppy melody to it. And then they make fun of the hardcore punk scene with the track The Revenge of Anus Presley. Their debut album, Psychic Powerless, Another Man's Sack, was released on Touch and Go at the end of 1984. Again, you got experimental noise rock, chaotic. It's got this industrial grind thing going on. But, surprisingly tight musicianship in there. I definitely hear the influence of the band Chrome on tracks like Eye of the Chicken. Their next album was Rembrandt Horse in 1986. And again, we're keeping with the experimental noise, but they got this catchy acid pop structure. Again, they're developing this unique psychedelic Texas noise punk. And there's also a lot of tape manipulation going on as well. They've embraced that also. Great cover of American Woman by the Guess Who. But for me, their masterpiece is Locus Abortion Technician from 1987. The album is just unpredictable. It's blending industrial textures, psychedelic chaos, but they got this thick, sludgy guitar, right? So it's like sludge metal riffs meets sound collage. And they do a parody or an ode, or maybe both, to Black Sabbath with the track Sweat Loaf. That's absolutely fantastic. And that's what the Butthole Surfers would do. They would take their kind of insane hippie meets punk aesthetic, and they would parody the kind of giants of classic rock. So their 1988 album was called Hairway to Steven, but they do a real fantastic cover of Donovan's Hurdy-Gurdy Man as well. That was released in 1990. Now, the Butthole Surfers, they played the first 1991 Lollapalooza festival, and with the breakthrough of Nirvana and the focus on underground music, they got a chance to sign with Capitol Records, and they released their major label debut in 1993, Independent Worm Saloon, and they actually got John Paul Jones of Led Zeppelin to produce the album. And then in 1996, their album Electric Larryland, they actually had a big hit called Pepper. But the band, they never went mainstream, and they continued to make music into millennium. Butthole Surfers, they're truly one of the most bizarre bands in the history of rock music, and they really push the boundaries musically and just philosophically. All of these bands in this episode show that Texas was a real hub for noise and experimentation. And in the next episode, I'm going to look at one of the contemporaries of the Butthole Surfers, and then I'm going to look at all of their children. Thank you for watching 20th Century Music and Arts. Please like, share, subscribe, and comment. Who's your favorite band from Texas?